Well, while people are joining in and zooming in, I know many folks are finishing up their morning clinic and getting to us, or ending another Zoom and joining on. So I'll do the talking, well, so that we can get to our speaker with as much time as possible. I'm super excited today to welcome to Academy of Medical Educator Grand Rounds, Dr. Melissa McNeil, a dear friend and colleague. Dr. McNeil received her undergraduate degree from Princeton University, her MD from the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, and a master's of public health from the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health. She's a professor emeritus of medicine at the University of Pittsburgh and has recently joined the faculty at Brown University, where she is a member of the Division of General Internal Medicine and will serve as an academic hospitalist. What a win for Brown, I have to say. Her special interests as an educator have been in the development of training programs designed to develop leaders in women's health education and research, and in the faculty development of educators. She's a founding member of the Academy of Master Educators at the University of Pittsburgh, has expertise in curriculum development, management of the struggling learner, and also mentorship. She's been widely recognized both locally and nationally for her achievements in medical education and women's health. From the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, she has received the Charles Watson Award for Teaching Excellence, the Donald S. Fraley Award for Student Mentoring, the Schuett Award for Master Educator, and the Distinguished Service Award in Medical Education. That's just a few of them. She was named the Society of General Internal Medicine's Distinguished Professor of Women's Health in 2014. And in 2016 received their Career Achievement in Medical Education, which recognizes an outstanding clinician educator for their lifetime contributions in medical education, both at their institution and nationally. I'm also really especially thankful to call Missy a mentor of mine and a dear, dear friend. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the University of Colorado virtually. We hope to have you back in person in the future, but we're really excited to hear your talk on receiving feedback today.
Well, thank you, Shanta. It is just a pleasure to be here. My only regret is that I'm not there in person with you. I'm gonna share my screen here. And let's make this work. And then, hold on one sec. Okay, I think we're good with that. That's good, Shanta?
Yep, looks great.
All right. All right, so what I want to do is actually take a little bit of a flip here. You know, we spend a lot of our time and energy thinking about how we give feedback as educators, but the reality of it is, just like we give feedback, we get feedback. And how we respond to feedback is really a mark of the true professional, I think. We were talking a little bit about it as we were waiting for the topic to start. And for our junior colleagues who don't have much feedback and sort of don't know where they are along the continuum of educators, it can be very demoralizing if you get negative feedback right in the beginning, or let's reframe that, constructive feedback right in the beginning. And then the next place to it is, you know, not all feedback is equal. Some feedback we take, some feedback we don't take, and you don't have to respond to every piece of feedback you get. So I'm gonna walk us through, and I have a couple of places in the talk where I am going to ask for your opinions. So be prepared to share. And then I think Linda's going to monitor the chat for me. So please feel free to ask questions or make comments as we go. And Linda, I'll count on you to share that with the group. So receiving feedback. We all say we want feedback, but do we really? We're actually kind of like our medical students and residents. We want feedback, but only if it's good, right? We love to be told that we were fabulous. We love to be told that we were just the best ward attending ever. But when we get feedback that's less than glowing, how do we respond? So my first question for you, have you ever received feedback you thought was unfair? And what did you do? If a couple of people would give me some comments in the chat, that would be fabulous. what you did with feedback you thought was unfair. This is always the awkward moment where you wait for people to finish doing their typing. I turned it into a title for a talk. I absolutely love that. Attempted to reflect and figure out if it was really unfair. Nice, nice. Because just because you felt like it was unfair doesn't necessarily mean it was. I love this. In younger days, engaged in debate, sat with it, rejected it, and then embraced it. I love this. And I agree with this. Learners want more independence, but we're in charge. I also like this answer. I went to a trusted source and asked them how I saw it. So you guys are great. Let's see where this takes us. So the common responses along the journey, it's kind of like the Kubler-Ross stages of adapting. You either argue the truth of the feedback, you dismiss it without merit, or you assume that part of the reason that the feedback was irrelevant is because the giver of the feedback has no credibility. The rare response is to listen for the truth, however painful it would be. And I love some of the answers you guys gave me about, I sat with it, I went and vetted it with somebody else, turned it into a talk to learn from it, just somewhat about this talk in truth. Okay. So I want to share with you a recent challenge that I had. My colleague and I run a women's leadership book club for first and second year medical students. The premise of the book club that we have designed and advertised to meet what we see as a need is that while there are certainly systemic issues in gender advancement, there are skills that women can develop that can improve their chances of being seen, heard, and achieving academic advancement. The goal of the book club is individual skill development, communication strategies, self-promotion. And we've been very clear about this. This is how we advertise it. This was our goals in giving it. This last year, we had given our first 3 sessions, and we received the following email from our first year medical students. So this would be maybe December of this individual's first year. And this was actually, of course, the year that everyone was virtual. So the students, nobody had been on campus. Everybody was, whether they're in Pittsburgh or not, or in their apartment. So the sort of professional identity had yet to be formed. So here's the email. I hope this email finds you well. I wanted to write to share some reflections and thoughts that I have had on the Women in Leadership in Medicine book club. I have really appreciated this mini elective and the work that you and Dr. McNeil put into this course. I find it instructive. It went to my more junior colleague and not me, but we'll let that one sit too. And then there was a litany of suggestions. The books we've read this far were published a while ago, like 2016, 2017. And some of the content seems less relevant given more recent events, i.e. the 2016 election. And they have illustrated that while there are systemic features that can inhibit women's progress, no matter how confident or well-versed she is in her skill sets. Although we certainly understand there's power in individual growth, we think these topics would be a little more digestible if there was at least some acknowledgement in our reading of these systemic issues. Building off this first point, it continues, building off this first point, while it's great to talk about theoretical situation, there are many things actively happening both in our personal lives and the world at large related to the topics we cover. And we think more specific and intentional connections to these current events would enhance our ability to understand them and to apply them to our lives. And I'll take a time out here from sharing this email to say that we run this as a book club. Please do the readings. How did it impact you? Or what did you think about it? So certainly there are plenty of opportunities for, we allow them to drive the conversation. And then it goes on. So here's what they would like. Lived experiences and perspectives from other women in medicine. And again, we so appreciate Dr. McNeil and you being willing to share. It would be greatly enhanced by hearing from other people. We would also like mixed media. Books are wonderful, but there are a lot of other ways in which people communicate and teach about women in leadership. And here are some TED Talks you might be interested in. Better targeting men to participate in this mini elective. This year, every single person in the book club is a woman, and the conversations we are having are so incredibly important for women in med. We think diversifying the participants would benefit all. And then finally, changing our next session to an open dialogue on what the rest of the year should look like. Some of these suggestions could be implemented immediately, and we would love the opportunity to be involved in the planning and the remainder of the course, if you and Dr. McNeil are willing to be flexible. So I'm interested in your thoughts. If you could use the chat, was this an appropriate email? Tone versus content? Their agenda versus ours? And how would you have responded? So I'm looking at some of the chat. The word "we" is used quite a bit. Was this for multiple students? Unclear. She implies, of course, that it is, but it was, just her signature on it. Anybody else have a response to this? Because I'm about to share with you our response to it. Their agenda for sure. Definitely more appropriate as a meeting. Seems a little bit pushy to get their agenda. I would ask to speak to her directly. Okay. So you guys are giving lots of thoughts about how to manage it. I'm curious about your response. And Miriam tells me the immediate inclination to refute point by point, take a step back and holistically explain your perspective. Oh, Jen, did you sense an entitlement tone? I sort of did, although the good Dr. Zimmer goes to the higher place that she's cautious about tone reading in emails. And then we might encourage, quote, them to use these ideas for a future meeting of their own. Okay. And the response, thanks for thoughtful feedback. But very thoughtful, but ask that you meet in person. And David is going to the high road. There was a lot of detailed feedback, which I rarely needs to see. And then I like what Lyra said here is that there needs to be a communication on purpose. So let me go forth and show you what happened. This is the texting that went on between Dr. Miriam and myself. So Dr. Miriam got the emails and she sent me this. Oh my, I just got an infuriating email from a medical student about our mini elective. I forwarded it to you. Maybe we can talk before I respond so I don't email from the basement. Wow. And I will share with you that this concept of being in the basement is something we all learned from Dr. Zimmer when she was in Pittsburgh. When your worst self floats to the top, it has pushed you to the basement where you are responding. For me, oh my, just read it. At this moment, I am in the basement. I feel like just bagging it. And this went on for a while. And then literally, I responded back to Sarah and I said, you know what, Sarah, we're giving the thanks for the feedback workshop for our residents the next day. And this was such a classic example of getting feedback that felt unfair and inappropriate. And yet at the same time, we had to sit with it and decide what we wanted to do. So what do we know about feedback? We've all grown up receiving endless feedback. We are graded, rated, ranked, coached, screened, scores. Even as elementary school children, pick first, pick last, not picked at all. Giving feedback is tough, but I would submit that receiving it is tougher. It's unfair. The timing is bad. Who does this person think they are? And I must say, in this particular situation, we spent a lot of time with that agenda, and they don't understand. And we are left feeling unappreciated, demotivated, and indignant. And really, part of I must say, my response to this particular set of feedback was, you guys are so lucky that Sarah and I are willing to have this conversation with you. You don't know what you don't know. All right, so the conundrum is when we give feedback, we notice that the receiver isn't good at receiving it. When we receive feedback, we notice that the giver isn't good at giving it. And this is just a funny little cartoon to illustrate it. I actually was apple picking over the weekend, so it seemed appropriate. But you love apples. I got a job as a fruit picker specifically so I could bring you free apples. Well, I don't like those apples, but they're really good. They lack panache, and I worked all week to get it. Feedback. Now go buy me an apple and make sure it has panache. The problem with feedback. All right, let's walk through an exercise, and I will sort of comment up front that much of this work comes from a fabulous book called Thanks for the Feedback, which I've referenced at the end of the talk. And some of the examples that they give that I'm about to share with you come from the feedback, because as you can see, this issue with feedback, receiving it, how we think about it, it can impact us with our learners, can impact us in our work environment, and can certainly impact us on the home front. So here's the scenario. Comment from a spouse. I don't like the way those pants look on you. What do you think the spouse meant? Well, there's a couple of options that your mind can go to. First, is there something wrong with the pair of pants? Second, was that a passive aggressive reference to the weight I've gained? Maybe they're bell bottoms and it's another dig about how I'm living in the past. Or maybe you're trying to help me look nice for the party, right? I would say that very few of us would go to that last one right off the bat. So let's keep that scenario in mind. And let's think a little bit about what is feedback. So feedback, and we all know, right? I mean, our learners always tell us we get no feedback, which is why we always instruct our educators to use the F word. You know, I mean, it's sort of always amazing to me when I critique and give advice about how to make a history and physical better, and you could have done this. Then at the end of the session, the learner says to me, could I have feedback? I'm like, well, I just gave you feedback. But I forgot to start with the word. I'm now going to give you feedback. So feedback includes any information you get about yourself. It's how we learn about ourselves from our experiences and from other people, how we learn about life, right? We learn, even when we don't get feedback, when we watch how people respond. Are people coming? Are they leaving? You know, when I give a talk, does everybody leave? Is everybody engaged? You know, that's feedback, whether people write it in the comments or not. So feedback is not just what gets ranked. It's what gets thanked, commented on, invited back, or dropped. So there's feedback. If you were a teacher in a course last year and you're not invited back this year, that's feedback. Feedback can be formal, informal, direct, or implied. And I would submit that if we're serious about growth and improvement, if we come to the table with a growth mindset, we have no choice but to get good at learning from just about anyone and everyone. So feedback is good for you, but is it good for you like a birthday gift or good for you like a colonoscopy? And I would argue that the positive feedback is like a birthday gift and the more constructive feedback is the colonoscopy. While we desire to learn and improve, we all say that we want feedback. Even if we're resentful when we get it, we also long to be loved, accepted, and respected just as we are, especially when we put a lot of work and effort into something and we get negative feedback. The very fact of getting feedback suggests that somehow we are not quite okay, so we bristle. And it's important to frame and remember as we move forward here, to remember that receiving feedback sits at the intersection of two needs, the drive to learn and the longing for acceptance, to be perfect. And so there's conflict there, right, in our own emotional response. And learning how to manage that conflict is actually really how we learn to receive feedback. So what do we do to receive feedback well? There's a lot that and this is a little bit like the book club. I'm going to talk about how we can handle ourselves. Now, I would ask you to also be thinking as I go through some of this discussion that feedback that's better is easier to receive. And so as we talk about the strategies of how to receive feedback well, you can also be intuiting how you can maybe give feedback better. So the point is, there's a lot that each of us can do to reduce the tension, and it can be between us and the person giving us feedback, or even our own internal tension. And I would submit that the ability to receive feedback well is not an inborn trait, but it's a skill that we can cultivate. It's not natural to just be thrilled when someone gives you constructive feedback. We can all get better. And I want to point out that receiving feedback well doesn't mean you have to take the feedback. Receiving it well means engaging in the conversation skillfully and making thoughtful choices about what to do with the information you receive. And we were talking a little bit about the tendency that some of us have, because we're fixers, right? That when you get feedback, to immediately make a change so that you make people happy. You make the people giving you feedback happy, and that's not necessarily the right choice. I will give you an example. In our third-year medicine clerkship at Pitt, routinely, we run six days a week, right? Because we're internal medicine inpatient clerkship. We're one of the few clerkships at Pitt that has 6 days a week clinical responsibilities. And every single block, we get feedback that running 6 days a week is heinous. It's unresponsive. They need that time. They need a day to attend to their wellness and a day to study, and so on and so forth. So we have heard the feedback. We even receive it well, but they still have to come in 6 days a week. So feedback comes from different places. So the first thing you have to do if you're going to receive feedback well is you have to understand the feedback. The first challenge is, and remember the pants, that we often don't know what the purpose of feedback is when given. And I would submit, for example, if we think back to the email that my colleague and I got from our first year medical students, at the very least, it was very clear what the purpose of that feedback was. Feedback can mean a number of things. It can range from a pat on the back to a dressing down. Helpful pointers are feedback, and so is getting voted off the island. Both are things that give you information. So the first agenda is to determine the type of feedback that's being given. And typically we think about feedback in 3 different domains. Appreciation, which is the feedback we all like. Thanks, you're great. That always feels good. That's the smiley face. Coaching, what you need to do to get better. So coaching doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem, but we can all get better. I have a colleague who is frustrated by the fact that when he lectures, he never feels like he gets feedback about what he can do to improve. So what he always, at the end of every lecture, he asks the audience to, and of course everything's on Zoom now, but he asks the audience to write in the chat 1 or 2 things that the audience would like to see more of. What a great invitation. That's a way to ask a question without threat. It's a way to ask the question without defensiveness, and gets him the information, at least what people like. And then evaluation is also feedback. Here's where you stand. We've been evaluated our whole lives, right? We get grades, although our younger colleagues are getting fewer and fewer grades. So here's where you stand. And that's feedback. It is evaluation. It can sometimes be painful, but it's all feedback. The trick here is that yes, I want feedback, but what I really want is appreciation feedback, or maybe coaching, and you're going to give me evaluation feedback. Feedback that says, this is the worst lecture I've ever been to. Feedback that says, I've had multiple other attendings and you were off the mark. Those are not feedback that's very helpful, and 2, it's very hard to hear. So the first take-home message is know what you want and know what you're getting. The match matters. So I'll refer back to my colleague who has decided to manage the feedback loop by asking for coaching. It doesn't need to be stroked, although you get some strokes when you know that at least somebody likes something you did. Like, so he asks for coaching, right? And then he gets what he wants. Now, we don't always get that. Certainly when we get evaluations from our learners in more formal coursework, we get evaluative feedback. But again, know what you're getting and know what you want and the match. And the next step to understanding when you get a negative response to the emotions, the negative emotions to the feedback you've gotten, is that there's probably a mismatch, and that mismatch causes feedback triggers. And those feedback triggers become obstacles to hearing and learning from feedback. So feedback triggers. Triggered reactions are not obstacles because they are necessarily unreasonable. For example, my triggered annoyance to our first year medical students was not necessarily unreasonable. But, and I'll share with you later how we decided to handle it, it became an obstacle, as you could certainly see from the texting that Dr. Miriam and I were doing, because it kept us from engaging skillfully in the conversation. Receiving feedback well is a process of sorting and filtering. And part of that filtering is taking a step back and learning how the other person sees things. It's about trying on ideas that at first seem a poor fit. And it's really about keeping the parts that feel right and discarding the parts of the feedback that in the end seem off or not what you need now. You have a choice what you do with the feedback, but I would submit that listening to, understanding, and engaging in the feedback is the only way to figure out the parts that feel right, because you are very often triggered when you first hear it. So there are 3 feedback triggers I want to introduce to you today. The first is a truth trigger. It's set off by the substance of the feedback. It's off, unhelpful, or simply untrue. The response is to feel indignant, wronged, or exasperated. Dr. McNeil never told us her expectations for the course. Well, Dr. McNeil always tells the expectations for the course. So this is a truth trigger. This was untrue. And I was triggered. The relationship trigger is triggered by the particular person giving the feedback. And so when you have a relationship, especially a relationship that is baseline somewhat contentious or difficult, it is very hard to get beyond the negative connotation that comes with a relationship and to think about the truth of what you're hearing. And then the last are the identity triggers. Identity triggers are about us. Something about the feedback causes our identity to become undone. We are threatened, undone, and demoralized. And I would argue for most of us as teachers who try really, really hard and put lots of effort in and have clear goals of things we want to communicate, when we get the kind of somewhat, I'm going to use the best possible framing of this, the very direct feedback that we sometimes get from our learners, it really cuts to the core of us because, in fact, we are trying very hard. And you get to the place sometimes, why do I bother? Why do I do this? I want to ask you a thing about Kip and Nancy. Kip and Nancy work for an organization that recruits talent for sought-after jobs. Nancy tells Kip that he seems biased against candidates with non-traditional backgrounds. Nancy says that his bias is seeping through during the interviews. Kip dismisses the feedback because he does not have a bias. In fact, though Nancy is not aware of it, Kip himself does not have a traditional background. So as far as Kip can tell, the feedback is simply wrong. So this is a truth trigger, right? So you say that's wrong, and therefore, because it's wrong, it's not helpful feedback. But I would ask you to change it to make sure that you are understanding where the feedback's coming from. And this is in, if you read any of the literature on difficult conversations or managing conflict, it's always seek first to understand. So, and to listen before you speak. And so this is a variation of the same. And I would ask you to learn that the words that should come out of your mouth when you hear feedback that feels uncomfortable is to just say, tell me more. And not to immediately put your value judgment that that's wrong to the label, because that will shut down feedback. Feedback labels are vague and confusing. When the statement was made that you are biased and it's coming across in your interview, there's not really a lot of information there. That's a value judgment. It's not a statement of fact. The giver has information, something that made the giver make that statement, but that hasn't been shared because the conclusion is what is shared. And the reality of it is we each interpret things very differently. You hear the conclusion and you say, that's not me. You cannot see ourselves, hear our tone of voice. We don't see our own blind spots. We need others around us to help us see ourselves and the impact that we might be having despite our best intentions. And this is crossing over a little bit into the microaggressions world, when the difference between intent and impact, right? Your intent might have been fabulous, but if the execution has an impact that you were not expecting, we all have to be open to hearing that. Because frankly, we want our intent to carry through. And if our intent gets lost, then we're not getting very far. So Kip was so distressed, he eventually asked Nancy to clarify her feedback. He said, tell me more. Nancy replies, when you interview traditional candidates, you describe the job and its challenges and see how they respond. With non-traditional candidates, you chat about their travels with a merchant marine. You're not taking them seriously. Kit now understands where Nancy is coming from. When you hear the facts behind the conclusion, with the tell me more, your mind is open. And again, Kip now understands where she's coming from. And the response doesn't have to say, oh my God, you're right, I'm so sorry. It can be, I do take them seriously. I'm just looking for different things in a non-traditional candidate. So they had a conversation and heard each other. And what Kip went on to do in his subsequent interviews remains unknown from the story in the book. But the point is, Kip can now think about it, and Nancy can view the issue that she was concerned about in a very different way. They had a conversation and each felt heard, which is all you can ask about feedback, right? That's all you can ask. We have Miriam and Mark. Mark and Miriam return from the bar mitzvah of Mark's nephew. Mark tells Miriam she should not be so aloof when she's with his relatives. She responds, that you will all resonate with this, I'm sure. She responds, do you know what I went through just to get to that bar mitzvah? The party for your nephew, whose name you cannot even remember? So what is going on? Well, clearly Miriam's not happy, right? You say, after all I've done for you, who are you to say those things for me? So now this actually is an example of a relationship trigger, because this is a scenario where past stuff is going to come to bear in this particular conversation. When you step back to see the relationship between the giver and the receiver, and most relationship triggers take place in people that you have relationships with, your spouse, close colleagues, a mentor or mentee relationship. The hard part here is to disentangle the relationship from the issues and to talk about the relationship separately from the issue. And that's the way to get out from under. But we hardly ever do this. We go straight to the relationship and don't hear or address the feedback. The topic of who are you, to tell me I should be nicer to your relatives when I moved heaven and earth to get there. Who are you? The topic of who defeats the topic of what. The what being Miriam probably wasn't very nice to his relations because she moved heaven and earth to get there. The original feedback is blocked out. And we all get to this place, especially, it's interesting, the people who may be most able to give us really difficult feedback are the people we have relationships with, but depending on the relationship, that can be the feedback that's hardest to hear. So clearly there are multiple issues between Miriam and Mark. Miriam feels unappreciated, but if the conversation immediately goes to the relationship issues, the concern that Mark is expressing comes across as aloof and will remain unheard. Both issues deserve to be discussed, but they are separate. So if Miriam had said, tell me more, which is just a fabulous three words, right? Tell me more. Maybe they would get to the discussion. The being unappreciated. I mean, and we do this all the time, especially I think on the family front. It goes to sort of the bigger issue and the actual issue at hand, goes to the relationship. And this is when people say, you always, you never. These are when you look at the language, the strategies for how to have good conversations, you never say never, you never say always, and you are advised to not bring up a separate complaint when you're dealing with one complaint, because then you just escalate it. And your goal really should be to de-escalate and both listen and be heard. So the last of the three sets of triggers is the identity trigger. And at least for me, this is the one that I struggle with the most. Identity is the story we tell ourselves about who we are. When critical feedback is incoming, the story that we've told ourselves is under attack and our security alarm sounds. And so, because that's not who I am, that's not what I did, how dare you say that to me? Because if your feedback is right, then my image of myself needs an adjustment. And so therefore our defense mechanisms get in the way. Before the giver gets out their second sentence, we gear up to the counterattack or just go through it. And the response to these identity triggers can be from minor agitation, the texting that Dr. Miriam and I took care of, or to prevent destabilization. I'm sure anybody who is more senior in the audience has had junior people in their office completely demoralized. I can't do this anymore. I can't teach. I can't be a doctor. When we get this a lot with patient interactions, right? When you get feedback from a patient that you're not meeting their needs and you feel like you've tried really, really hard and you want to be a good doctor, these are really hard sets of feedback to even hear, let alone act on. So we'll go back to the initial case that I presented. And I would clearly say the course directors were frustrated. There were a lot of triggers at play. Truth triggers, they are wrong. We know what they need to learn. And part of our wisdom was that, they're a friggin' first year medical student. They can't make structural change, but they can learn to manage themselves better so they can get to a place where they can make structural change. There were certainly relationship issues at play. Who are these first year medical students to be giving us this feedback? Don't we deserve some respect? Don't they know how wise and experienced they are? I am the beloved, wise, and all-knowing Dr. McNeil. And who the hell are you to be doing this? The biggest barrier to hearing the feedback for us was actually the inability to even remotely conceive that we were not providing some thoughtful, helpful product. This feedback was so counter to our self-image and actually to where we had been. We've given this course before that we remained baffled about what to do. So the identity triggers, you can go to a number of different places. I screw everything up, I'm doomed, I'm not a bad person, or am I? Learn how your wiring affects how you hear feedback. There's a wide variation in the reaction to both positive and negative feedback. Extreme reactions color our sense of self, and I like this is when folks have really extreme reactions. I would say that one of the things that's really helpful with these identity triggers is the comment that someone made in the earlier chat about go find somebody wiser to help you brainstorm it. Now that can be challenging, right? Because you want to go to somebody higher up the food chain, your mentor, your division director, your dean, and share that you got this, but that makes you vulnerable. So that's hard to do. But I suspect you would be surprised what you hear. Everyone has a story, we all have multiple stories about how we've been in that place. Don't forget your peers, right? Your peers can help you too. So the goal here is to dismantle the distortions, to not catastrophize, to see the feedback at actual size, to work to correct distorted thinking and regain balance. And sometimes folks don't take the time to give you positive feedback. We will talk about the feedback sandwich, which I'm actually not really a huge fan about. But, if you don't get positive feedback along the way, and the only feedback you get is corrective, it's very demoralizing. Note, way to think about it when we give feedback, right? You can't just tell people what they need to do to improve. For all of us, we need to cultivate a growth identity. We talk a lot about wanting our learners to have a growth mindset, that we want them to be able to hear that they could have included more pertinent positives and negatives in their history and physical. Their differential diagnosis could have been broader. And it's not what they did was wrong. It's that there was so much more they could do. That's the growth mindset. But we need it too. And I would argue that the trying to get the framework in your head, remember the 3 types of feedback, there's appreciation, there's coaching, and there's evaluation. If we can all sort of think about feedback as a form of coaching, that is in fact very helpful as a way to process some of the and again, I want you to notice that for the most part, I'm trying to use the word constructive feedback, not negative feedback, because if something could be better, you can grow from it. And again, challenge is the fastest track to growth. So, again, excuse me. So I want to recap a little bit where I've been and then sort of open it up for discussion. I would ask you, when you get feedback that is not appreciative feedback, seek first to understand. I would, and tell me more is just, it's a little bit like we train you when you're in the world. I'm a women's health talk. So when we're in the world of intimate partner violence and somebody discloses to you intimate partner violence, we teach you just to say the same thing every time. Same thing every time. So you don't have to think about it, you don't have to stress. And what you say in that setting is, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And it's an open-ended statement. If you get feedback that you're uncomfortable with, say, tell me more. Make sure you're understanding what led to the feedback, not just the judgment. I would actually argue as well that if you get positive feedback, you should also say, tell me more, right? If somebody says to me, gosh, I really enjoyed working with Teddy, it was just great. You should say, oh, I'm so glad yay, that was appreciative and evaluative feedback. That was so nice. But you should also ask, tell me what I did that you really liked. Because maybe you just got lucky, right? Knowing what was good can help you do more of it. And you need to remember that before you can tell if feedback is right or wrong, you have to understand it. Feedback often comes with the generic labels. We go straight to putting the behavior on it without describing the actual what happened. Be more proactive, be more assertive, have more confidence. Well, that's not really helpful. What's much more helpful, for example, is to say when the hematology team feedback to a resident. When the hematology team came by and said they were going to just discharge the patient and have them follow up in like, a month from 200 miles away in the outpatient clinic, you knew that that was not a plan that was going to work. One of the things that you could have done in that setting is to actually be a little more assertive and have the confidence of your convictions that you were doing the right thing for the patient, and maybe push back a little harder, right? So that is a better way to give feedback. If you get the feedback with the generic label, have more confidence, say, gosh, could you tell me what you mean by that? What behaviors did you see that lead you to say that? And this is the shift from that's wrong to tell me more. The what was heard versus the what was meant mismatch is surprisingly uncommon. And I want you to think back to Nancy and Kip and about the bias in the conversation there. To fully understand feedback, you need to discuss both where it's coming from and where it's going. Where feedback is coming from means, again, and I just talked about this, what was the data? What was it you saw that made you make the sweeping statement that I need to be more assertive or more proactive? And then where feedback is going means, what is it you want me to do with this feedback? Can you give me advice on how I could have handled it differently, right? So I got feedback that was uncomfortable with the label. I asked for the supporting data, but I also demonstrated my growth mindset to say, what would you have had me do? And again, it's important to remember to ask that what is different between you and the feedback with regard to the data and our interpretations about the rules. There's very different things that a medical student or resident can do than an attending can do. So sometimes the feedback you get about how it should be handled doesn't manage. And as faculty, that's true for us too, right? There are people who are junior, there are people who are senior, there are people who are high status and low status. So sometimes the advice you get isn't all that helpful, but at least you should ask for it. So you've done all the hard work. You're open, you have a growth mindset, you identified your triggers, you said, tell me more. Can you explain to me why you've done all of the good stuff? And you may well get to the point of fully understanding where the feedback is coming from and still simply disagree. You see it differently. We all have different values. We all have different priorities, and that's okay. And while this may be frustrating that the feedback was wrong, from a communication standpoint, you've succeeded. The goal is for you to understand the feedback giver's position and for them to understand you. And once you've done all that, it's okay to disagree. And I give you some phrases that I find really helpful. Wow, that's upsetting to hear. That's often how I will think about my identity trigger stuff. It's upsetting for me to hear that somebody thought that about me. Or I would never have imagined that my statement would have generated that kind of response. And that is so far from how I see myself. And it's okay. Again, please note that these statements don't discount the feedback. It identifies your reaction to it. And sometimes the answer is, and this is the book, of course, thanks for the feedback. You always, always, always say, thanks for the feedback, tell me more. If you get to this place where you still disagree, you still say, thanks for the feedback. I'm going to have to spend some time thinking about that and processing that. What a fabulous closure, right? Because you're not arguing, you're not debating, you're not pushing back, you're not saying they're right, you're remaining open and trying to have a growth mindset. So my take-home message is we all have blind spots because we can't see our own faces, we can't hear our tone of voice, and we're unaware of even big patterns of behavior. I got some feedback. I always thought I had a really fabulous poker face and no one ever knew what I was thinking. And I actually think the good Dr. Zimmer was the one who shared with me that my poker face was really that I shouldn't play poker because I was very easy to read, mostly because I'm usually chipper and upbeat most of the time. And when I go to quiet, I'm irritable, and it's very obvious and everyone knows it. So, but that was really helpful feedback to me because I then had the choice of not being quiet or knowing that I was sharing that I was irritable and I could make a decision whether I wanted to do it because I was unaware of the pattern of my behavior. Our blind spots are amplified by a couple of things. One is what is labeled emotional math. We discount our emotions while others count them double, right? Attribution, we attribute our failure to the situation while others attribute it to our character. Well, this would have happened to anybody if this were the situation. And then again, this impact intent gap that we are increasingly aware of. Your intentions may be good, and that's important. It's important that your intentions are good. But to be effective, you have to get the impact you want. So we judge ourselves by our intentions while others judge us by the impact. And understanding the impact we have despite our intentions is really important. So to see ourselves in our blind spot, we need help from others. Invite others to be an honest mirror to help you see yourself in the moment. It's a growth mindset. Feedback is about looking forward, not about looking back. It's not about, was this right? Was this wrong? What could I do? Reality is in the eye of the beholder. And that's just the way it is, right? Whether you meant to create this environment or not, you did. And so it's not about, was it true or why it happened? It's about, what can I do differently to make it not happen again? And ask, how am I getting in my own way? So this is the book and the authors. I will finish by sharing with you that what we decided to do with our book club is we devoted the next session to a discussion because we actually begrudgingly went to a more mature place and said, while our intentions were good and we clearly knew more than they do and they were off base, we were not getting through to them, right? And so again, we were right, but we were ineffective. And so in order to be more effective, we had to meet them halfway. So it was just share with you, fascinating. We had this whole discussion and we asked people to submit us readings. And then actually we sort of stepped up a little bit and we asked the students to take ownership of the last 2 sessions. This is what you want to do. We'll be happy to help you. And I will share with you that the young woman who wrote that email never came to another class again. It was really interesting, despite our maturity. And I think she just, got busy, but it's so interesting in your own sense of, like, for me, at least, if I'd sent that email, I'd have made sure I was at every single other session, right? Because, oh my gosh, I put myself on the line. So I'll just leave it that I went to a mature place that day and it was good. So with that, I will stop my sharing and see if any questions have come in through the chat or in person.
Dr. McNeil, thank you so much. I see one question coming in from Andy Wood. You might see in the chat. He, I presume, says, this is all so helpful to me in defensive and dismissive postures. This question may be outside the scope of this time, but did you have any thoughts on if a passive response is ever unhelpful?
I will answer that to the extent that if you are in a situation, right, where it's not about it, the place that I think that it can be unhelpful is in the setting of patient care, right? If you feel strongly that something is not right, you still should say, well, tell me more why you're thinking about that, right? Staying in conversation is always good, but you may need to actually move to a place of advocacy for your opinion sooner rather than later. But you have to weigh the pros and cons of that. It has to be something really important, really, really, really important to engage in at that particular time.
Thank you. That makes sense.
I had a question about sorry, Linda,
Yeah,
about
go ahead,
advice
Shanta.
for sort of moving the institutional culture in that direction. You probably know more about our curriculum reform than you would like to, but we're in a position right now as an institution where we're asking for and receiving a lot of feedback. And I would like for us to have a culture where this is where we go instead of to the basement, is to that growth mindset place kind of as a group.
So I think my answer to that would be that practice takes you along the way. So working on it in your own individual feedback, you get better at it. And so then when you see it as sort of the evaluation of a particular course or a new initiative that you have, you don't necessarily go to the basement. I would also say, at least one of the things for me is I've taken myself off the hook a little bit about going to the basement first, as long as I come out of it, right? If you think about sort of our responses, which I share in lectures at Pitt with some of the learners who were there, but we, as people who in theory know this content material, went immediately to the basement, and that was okay. And then we pulled ourselves out and managed it differently. So I think that as an institution, having some folks, your leaders of your curricular things, being trained to say, okay, let's think about what this means, or let's think about it from their perspective. And sometimes you don't have to change what you do, you just have to change how you package it, right? And a better introduction and a better explanation. And frankly, sometimes it's okay just to decide the feedback had no merit. That doesn't mean you have to get mad at it. There's a little bit of a different stance there. I'll respond. Let me just respond to David's comment about the emotional math.
Mhm.
It has to do with the math of who's right and who's wrong. I know my intentions, you see the impact, and we both are sure we're right. And so, one cannot equal two. So it's just a term that's used in that setting, that when we both see the world through different lenses.
Dr. McNeil, do you teach this differently to your residents and students? I love this for junior faculty, and for senior faculty, the internal is, being able to be a connoisseur, being a vulnerable leader, being able to take the feedback, internalize it, figure it out, take what you need, but I hesitate. I was planning on showing this to my learners, but I hesitate a little bit in terms of their being able to take or leave feedback. I want to be able to say to them, will you at least have to try it out, right?
Well, I actually think you can change the examples. Some of the reasons I like the examples here are because they're not medical, right? They sort of
Yes.
take it out of a charged environment. But one of the complaints we get the most from our faculty, I say we now, I'm sort of like between institutions. So the royal we get from our faculty is that we give our students feedback and they don't hear it. They argue it. It's your histories and physicals could have been more complete. And let me tell you what you should have included. And we get back from them, you never told me to do that, or this was not in the expectations, or I worked really hard, right? That you hear that all the time. And I actually think one of the things I hear from our faculty, the faculty I've worked with for a long time, is students say they want feedback, but they don't like the feedback if it's not, you're getting honors. And so training the learner that the best gift you can get is when somebody cares enough about you to tell you how to get better is so important. The other piece to this, so you might want to take out of it a little bit, like some of the stuff about if you don't agree with it, dismiss it, right? Because when we're talking about educational content, that's a little bit different. the other thing we see a lot from our learners is they say things like, can you tell me how to get honors? And the feedback we give in that setting is that's the wrong question. The question is, let me tell you how to be better, right? Because there's a continuum. And so it's really about the pursuit of excellence. And that's a hard sell, right? Because grades matter to these kids. They're high stakes. So it's true. But getting the other flip side of this is also when you give this talk, you also, at least for me, it also makes me think about how I give feedback. I tend now to try and describe the scenario that led me to my judgment. So I do the tell me more up front rather than just the conclusion.
Thank you.
So I like that. I want to teach that to my kids, spouses, neighbors, in-laws, right? I mean, everybody in your sphere. Karen has a comment. Are there situations where the history of relationship proving between teacher and learner where you ever advocate switching? I think the answer is that would go to your good Dean, Dr. Zimmer. But I think it's situational. I think there are some times where it has been so difficult that perhaps it's better for everybody, the teacher and the learner, to have a fresh start. On the other hand, the reality of it is, and we do teach our children this, right? You can't walk away from everybody who made your life a little bit more difficult. Because actually some of those people, they didn't give me honors the last time I had them. Well, maybe that was a good thing. So I think it's very situational. And there are ways to move beyond this dynamic. I actually find it very hard to do when you're in a high stakes third year clerkship with grades. If it's in the first 2 years where it's small group and it's pass fail, maybe differently. I don't know, Shanta, you want to weigh in on that? Because it would come to you to rearrange people.
Yeah, I think, there's always a situation where that could happen. And, it definitely depends. I think coaching, and we just implemented a coaching program too, may help people work through the relationship part of it. I think that's the hardest part for faculty too, when you're trying, because we all try to work so closely together and assume positive intent, that the relationship part can get in the way if it's taken personally. So I think coaching students on how to get through that is really useful, and sometimes that can salvage those opportunities so that you don't have to make a switch.
Well, and it's a growth experience for the learner, right? I mean, because fast forward to your resident or a faculty, right? You don't get to come in and say, well, I don't want to be with Dr. McNeil, my attending, because she gave me a lot of negative feedback last time. I was like, well, you got Dr. McNeil. I don't want to, be a faculty member with this person, right? I mean, you got to learn how to manage growth mindset, deal with people that are difficult.
Great. Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour here. This was a wonderful talk, lots of great interaction, and hopefully you all will take an opportunity to give Dr. McNeil some feedback with our survey link, as well as some opportunities to give feedback to us.
Tell me what you liked. Tell me what you liked.
Tell her some specifics that you liked, and also tell us what you'd like to see more of in these types of grand rounds. I want to say a special thank you to Erin McKay for all of the logistics help to make this a really successful talk. Erin did put also a link into the chat for the book. Thanks for the feedback. And thanks also to Linda and Molly for helping us keep this grand round series going during the Zoom time. We had record attendance today. Thank you, Dr. McNeil, so very, very much.
I look forward to coming in person.
Bye,
guys. Thank you.
Bye.